here at the Winona Arts Center. And I'm Sharon Mansur. I'm a Winona area dance and interdisciplinary artist, educator, and community mover and shaker. And I'm so thrilled to be here with Nancy. So I wanted to read Nancy's bio and then talk a little bit about our connection. And then Nancy will take it from there. So Nancy Sharon Valentine is a Chinese-American artist living and making a life in rural Audacity County, Minnesota. Conceived as the second child of a family residing in Lanzhou, Gansu, during the era of China's one-child policy, Valentine views her artistry as a channel to deepen her cultural connection to and between her Chinese heritage and Midwestern roots. Valentine's artwork is woven with nuance and symbolism, resulting in conceptually complex visual stories meant to evoke empathy. So Nancy and I have been connected virtually for many years through Springboard for the Arts, a wonderful arts nonprofit based in the Twin Cities. We also have our rural office in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And then through Department of Public Transformation, which is in western Minnesota. I had a chance to do a residency at their guest house this summer, which was amazing. And so, yeah, I think through our rural arts connections, we've known about each other and followed each other's work. And when I saw this exhibit, this Audacity exhibit online, I just fell in love with it, and I really wanted to bring it here to Winona. Yeah, just something about the movement and the energy. I responded visually and through the motion, the kinetic power of work, as well as the color, and as well as Nancy really expressing very personal feelings and experiences being Asian American in a rural area in this country. And that really spoke to me about some of the work I'm delving into here as an Arab American living here. So yeah, I just reached out to see if the Winona Arts Center would be interested in presenting the work, and they were. So I'm so grateful for the host here and for you all to be here to welcome her to Winona. It's the first time
in this capacity.
Anyway, so yeah, I just welcome Nancy to come and talk more about her work and to just be nestled, just being held in the space of her artistry.
Well, thank you all for coming, especially on a Sunday afternoon when there are so many other amazing community events you could be at. So I appreciate you traveling and for you to making the time and being here. My name is Nancy Sharon Valentine, and I am the artist who created the series before you. I'm going to start out by sharing a little bit about my personal story, which is a huge motivator behind the generation of this series. And then I'll share a little bit about the actual technical side of creating the scrolls. So I often say that it would be remiss of me to start my story with myself. It really begins with a woman named Xiaorong Hao. And Xiaorong Hao was a woman who was living in Lanzhou, Gansu in the 90s. She had a son, she was married, and then that man left. He left her and this baby boy. And since China is an honor and shame-based culture, this woman had to move back in with her parents. At the same time, my mother, Xiaorong Hao, had a brother who was living in the States who was doing his medical residency. So he was working to become a doctor here in the States. And he met a man named Michael Valentine. Michael was a Vietnam War vet. He was a divorced man, and he was a physician's assistant. So he was connected through the hospital they worked at. And once he got to get to know my mother's brother, they formed a relationship, a friendly relationship where you share a little bit about your family, a little bit about your interests. And eventually he showed a family photograph with Michael. And of course, he went through each of the faces, and when he saw this beautiful woman named Sharon, he asked, who is that? And when he heard about the story of Sharon being divorced and moving back in with her parents, he expressed interest. At the time, again, because it was honor and shame-based culture, the way to become honored again would have been for my mother to remarry. But because she had been divorced and because she had a son, it was virtually impossible for her to marry within her own culture again. At the time, though, China really viewed the US as the epitome of freedom. They really, they had just gone through this cultural revolution, and they had implemented what was called the one-child policy, which was really restrictive around family planning, and the government's solution to what they were seeing as overpopulation and under-resourcing. So Michael wrote letters back and forth with my grandparents and my uncle, who was bilingual at the time and still is. He translated the letters back and forth. And eventually, what happened was Michael sold all of his possessions and he flew to China. This was in December of 1991. When my family went to go pick him up from the airport, my grandparents introduced Sharon to Michael, and the way they introduced him was by saying, "This is your new husband." My mother, being the dutiful woman that she was and understanding that there were no other options for her, married him. So they were married, and it was December, and when you get married, you often consummate a marriage. The action took place, and my conception happened. A few months later, my conception was discovered. And so with China's one-child policy, what many people don't realize was that women were not given the choice. The government encouraged the family planning, and they enforced that by forcing appointments where those children would be aborted. When Michael found out that that was going to be the fate of his only blood child, he came back to the US. Though he had sold all of his possessions, what he did keep was a one-bedroom cabin on Wall Lake, just outside of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. That one-bedroom cabin is where he returned, and he filed paperwork. He met people who were resourced and well-rehearsed with the immigration system, and he moved mountains to be able to bring his wife that he had just married, his unborn child, and his newly adopted son to the US. So in February of 1992, just 10 days before my government scheduled abortion date, my mother and my brother landed in Fargo, North Dakota, and my dad picked them up. 6 months later, I was born, and my family has been in Fergus Falls ever since. Now, that story I share because it's my story, and it also shares with you so many of the stars that had to come and align in order for me to be here. A few years later, Michael, being a Vietnam War vet and someone who struggled with alcoholism because of PTSD, he succumbed to his alcoholism, and so he passed away. Oftentimes when I share about my mother coming to the US, they think, oh, she must have learned English while she was in China. That was not the case. She did not learn English until she came here. And when I share that, I mean to say so much of my story and my experience in Fergus Falls is influenced by the fact that I was raised by the village. The people that taught my mom English were these women named Nancy and Janet, who we met through the Federated Church in Fergus Falls, which is the congregation that my dad was connected to, who helped him to help them to come here. I share that with you because this series before you is originally titled The Audacity to be Asian in Rural America. We owe you no apologies. And a major reason why this was created was because in 2020, when this pandemic affected all of us, there was the cultural uprising in the Twin Cities because of the George Floyd murder. And at the time in Fergus Falls, though 2.5 hours away, there were conversations that were being spurred. Conversations about race, about culture, about empathy, about policing. And when that happened, I saw my community respond. They wanted to engage, they wanted to empathize, they wanted to learn more. But then when we fast forward to 2021, that spring, there were shootings down in Atlanta. 8 people were murdered. They were spa workers, 6 of whom were of Asian descent. And I thought to myself at the time, if people were responding to George Floyd, maybe people would respond with compassion to this as well. I thought I could look out into my community and see people who might care. That was the case for some, but the vast majority of folks hadn't even heard about it. And I don't necessarily blame them, but what really impacted me was the fact that I looked to my community for empathy, for compassion, and instead I was questioned why I cared. People couldn't understand why something that happened so far away to people I didn't know would impact me so deeply. And that's when I realized my community before me doesn't get it. And they probably hadn't been exposed to that. So at the time, there were all these different protests happening and community gatherings and discussions. And to be quite honest, I was fatigued. I didn't have the energy to go out into the community to do those things, but I did know how to paint. I did know how to create artwork. And I had been an artist up until that point, but I'd never created a series of artwork that was so personal or shared anything that I was going through. That spring, Springboard for the Arts had an opportunity that they came out with, which was called Artists Respond, Equitable Rural Futures. And what this was a funding opportunity for artists in rural communities to do what they were going to do. You proposed a project and they reviewed and they selected, and I proposed a series, and I didn't know how that would manifest, but I knew with some conviction that I had some things to finally say. And so I was surprised, but I received the funding. And it was a modest $2,500, but at the time it was the biggest grant I had ever received. And it was so emboldening for me to receive support from a national organization to create work that felt really meaningful to me. So that spring, I got to work. I gathered my materials, I created my concept, and I started to think, if anyone in Minnesota knows nothing about Chinese culture, what have they likely encountered? Well, they've probably been to a Chinese buffet, and they've probably had one of those little red placemats, and they've probably traced their finger around to find the year they were born, to find the animal that represented their Chinese zodiac. So that was my entrance point, and that's the genesis of this series. In addition to the series being created, I decided, how can I meld the Eastern and the Western for myself? How can I use these animals that Western folks understand and weave in symbolism, color, meaning, attributes from Eastern cultures? And then I started to think about my family members and what animals they were. And then I started to think about the stories that were pretty interwoven with each of those people. And what before you is a story. Each scroll holds a story of my family. Some of them are individual family members, and some of them are themes overall. Most of them are about my mother. and one of them is about me. I created the series to the point where they were finished to this point, an interim point where they were painted onto rice paper but not mounted. And when I finished them, I invited my community to the Historical Society where they were hosted as an exhibition and hosted what was called a listening circle. So in this listening circle, a couple of other Asian identifying individuals who were raised in Fergus Falls had the chance to share about their experience of being raised in our community. A community filled with 14,000 people, and from the most recent census, what I had learned is there are 58 Asian people in those 14,000, and my family accounts for 5 of them. So when you are in the vast minority, it's a different experience than if you were in the vast majority. And that listening circle saw 60 people come out and sit in the audience. And if you are from a rural community, that feels like a very, very large number of people. And though it's not necessarily about the number, what it spurred was conversation and connection. And at the time, because my heart was so deeply broken, I had desperately reached out to galleries all across the state of Minnesota, asking them if they would be interested in hosting this series. And throughout the next couple of years, I applied for grant opportunities. And the reason why they are mounted to silk brocade is because I received a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board to be able to do that. And there are artist statements that go with each and every scroll that I have a working draft of, thanks to another grant. And so I appreciate your support in bringing this series to where it is today, because what it does is it acts as a bridge builder. It helps me to share stories with you, with people from rural communities who don't share my cultural identity, at least one half of it. And my motivation for that is really rooted in rural relationships. What I've discovered throughout my life is that when something is familiar to you, when you've seen something before, when you've had a positive interaction before, it sets the stage for you to have a more positive outlook on future interactions. So if you have one positive interaction with a Chinese person, maybe the next time that you see another Chinese person, you'll give them the benefit of the doubt, or an interest, or an invitation, or a friendly smile instead of looking away. My motivation today is more oriented towards connecting and hearing as well as sharing. I think when this series first started, I so desperately wanted to feel heard. And so the folks who would come to those receptions, they heard some very intimate details about my story and my family's story. And I am happy to answer questions, but I will definitely save you some of the pains that are interwoven in some of these pieces. This is the last stop on the tour. It's been touring for 2 years, and though I am open to continuing it, what I was just sharing with Sharon is that I'm ready to create something new. This series to me has helped me to alchemize so much pain into not only beauty, but archive, family archive. When my family immigrated to the US, they had to leave things behind. Family photos, family stories, family heirlooms. And so as someone who is biracial, who doesn't have a lot of other Chinese folks in my community, it's up to me to carry that legacy forward, to teach my offspring that heritage, and to share those stories so that they're not forgotten. Though this is the last stop on this tour, these pieces will live on in our family. We're gonna pass them on, we're gonna keep them living, we're gonna do a little bit of gluing here and there so they don't fall apart. But what I really want to say about this series is that, and I will get emotional here because it is so tender to me, is that it is truly a love letter to my mother. You know, when you look at every single one of these scrolls, they're named by their animal. except for Tiger Mom. And what you see there is a tiger who is looking back. And what's next to her are these two little baby shoes. And in China, oftentimes, to help children start to walk earlier, they'll put squeakers in the bottoms of your shoes. And oftentimes, they'll put animals on top. And mine came with these little tiger cubs on top. And what I've learned throughout my lifetime is that a tiger will not attack unprovoked. My mother has always been known as a very fierce woman. She's a very stoic woman. She experiences joy, she experiences sorrow, but in the public, she has had to learn how to have a thick skin, how to become defensive before she can get hurt, how to protect her children before they are subject to pain. And sometimes she forgot to drop that harshness when she entered the threshold of her home. And so I have a lot of compassion for her in those ways. And I also have so much admiration and gratitude for the ways in which she sacrificed a lifetime. She came here when she was 30 years old. I am 31. And imagining my entire life up until this point and moving to a country that I don't know the customs, the economic system, or the language, and trying to start new. She's made a life for herself. When you look at the rooster, that represents my mother and the role that she had to play as both a mother and a father. When my father passed away, you know, when you think of a rooster, you think of a male chicken. And I placed the eggs there so that you can see how she had to play both gender roles in order to raise us. What you see behind it is this swath of gold, but if you step back and if you remove the black, what you'll see is the outline of a school bus driving up. And the reason why I put that there is because my mother was a music school teacher, an elementary school music teacher, all throughout her career in China. But when she came here, the accreditation didn't transfer. And by the time she knew enough language and got her AA, those teachers had passed. The institutions no longer existed. And so again, the accreditation couldn't transfer. She had no hope of becoming what she was. And so she pursued what she could. And the only place that would hire her was our bus company as an aide, strapping down wheelchairs until her back could no longer handle it. And when that day came, she not only read the book and studied to become a driver, she memorized the book in order to pass the tests, in order to become a driver. She became a driver, and I was so proud of her. And you would think that that would help her beat any scrutiny. But because of our rural region not having many experiences with Asian women, what are the jokes that you think of? Oh, a woman Asian driver. She was ruthlessly made fun of and never given a chance. Until 2016, every year this bus company has the Bus Olympics. And it's both quizzical and funny, but it's also something that people take pride in. And I remember they had one challenge where you needed to drive your bus through the parking garage, and they hung these little ping pong balls from the ceiling, and you had to be just perfect in every turn. Every single bus driver failed except for her. These are just two examples of the scrolls that I share. And I'm happy to share more, but I'll shift now to more of the technical side of things. You know, as an artist, I started in watercolor because that's something that was really, well, accessible to me. I could go to Walmart and I could afford a 97-cent palette from Crayola. I could get paper from the local nonprofits. I could do that. But what I didn't realize was that the more I used this medium, the more it would bring me back to the trips to China in the summer that my mom would save all year for. We were raised under the poverty line but she tucked away a few dollars every month so that in the summers we could have 4 weeks in her hometown with her extended family. She preserved that culture for us. And on those trips, there are these very famous hikes where folks would hike to the top of these mountains, and oftentimes at the top of the mountain there's a temple. Many different spiritualities, many different temples, but what is common at the top of temples is prayer. And all throughout my upbringing, what I can recall is these elders who would take long stalks and tie up little mopped ends to essentially create long paintbrushes. And they would write out their prayers in Chinese characters. And the whole concept of that is that as they write their prayers, once the water dries, it's the prayers going up into the spiritual realm. And so as I started to shift my perspective in creating my works, I started to see it as not only a creative expression, but also a spiritual practice. It's a medium that makes me feel connected to my Chinese culture, both in origin of the medium, but also the expressive brushwork. And so when you look at my line work, it is very inspired by how swift those Chinese calligraphy characters are. And what really draws me to the medium is the fact that it is so organic. When I have a concept and I think about it and then the execution, I'm a very fast painter. It's 12 to 15 minutes per piece, and it's focused. And so what I hope is communicated through that is the emotion, the experience, the process, the prayers. What I find very, very special about this work and has influenced much of my work since then is the minutia. So with watercolor, you're given a pigment, and what do you have to do? You need to add water to activate the medium, to turn pigment into paint. And so what I've done with this series to connect myself to the East, my mother was born along the Huanghe, which is the Yellow River. She moved to Otter Tail County, and what is Otter Tail County known for? The Otter Tail River. So water sourced from the lake that I live on, which is a part of the same watershed, was used to activate my watercolors. And so every single painting here has water from that river system in it. And the reason why I find that so fascinating is because when you take water from a natural body, it is unique in its makeup, the minerals, the fish goo, all of the things that are in it. And pigment reacts differently. If you think of things that oxidize, if you think of things that rust, things like that, that influences the way that your pigments come forward. And so that's where I talk about nuance. Each piece is meant to really pull those parts of me together. And when I shift over here, what I wanted to share with you here is that I've decided to incorporate also the elements, because what many people do know about the Chinese zodiac is the animals, but what they don't realize is that there's 5 elements that also are a part of it. So this is only 3. I can count, I promise. I have wood, water, and earth. The other 2 missing are fire and metal. And the way those interact is it means that it turns it into a 60-year rotation, not a 12-year rotation. So the animals rotate every 12 years, but it's a different element. And so in the Chinese culture and many Eastern cultures, they put so much weight into what your zodiac is, because that's representative of an entire generation. So think of, I mean, right now we're talking about COVID babies or 9/11 babies or things like that. These huge events that happen that influence a generation each differently. And so for me, I am a water monkey, and there's a lot of things woven into that, but I do recognize that I can get long-winded. So at this point, I will say thank you. Thank you for making the time to come out here. I am happy to answer any questions you may have, technical, otherwise. If you'd like to hear more about a different scroll, again, happy to share that. But ultimately, I just am so grateful to be able to make this trip. It's a 5-hour trip, but I keep saying well worth it because look at the community you're in. I see it. It's pretty amazing. So thank you for welcoming me here and helping me to share this work with your community. If you have questions, I will take them, but if you don't, all good.